Welcome, everyone, and thanks for joining us for this panel. So this is the panel 2 of the CBOL Global Network Conference 2023 on from decoupling to de-risking implications and the way forward. My name is Henry Gao. I'm a professor of law at the Singapore Management University, and I'm very honored to chair this panel, which will feature presentations from 4 distinguished panelists, all of whom are highly accomplished and all come from different countries in the region. So to start with, we will have a Professor Jimin Lee, who's a professor of law from Seoul National University in Korea, who will be talking about time for defogging, realigning national security in international economic regime. Basically, he will give us some overview on the issue. And then we will have a Professor James Nadapura, who is a professor at the India Institute for Foreign Trade, and also the holder of the WTO chair. And I'm extremely pleased to say that in my capacity also as a board member of the WTO chairs program, to see a fellow member of the WTO chairs family to present on inclusive and resilient supply chains and the place of non-trade and sustainability concerns. Then we will have a Professor Yuka Fukunaga, who is from Waseda University in Japan, who will be speaking on how to define and respond to economic coercion. And last but certainly not least, we have a Professor Jingxia Shi, who is currently with Renmin University of China, right? I hope I'm right on that. Yes, because Jingxia has been moving chairs to decouple or to de-risk a perspective from the trade rules. We will start with Professor Lee, please.
Thank you, Professor Gao, and Professor Wei Yuanzhu and other colleagues. It's a great honor to be on this panel number 2, to talk about decoupling and de-risking and its implications and the way forward for the global economic regime. I will briefly talk about the concept of economic security and how it would be understood from the perspective of international economic law and international law, and how what we can do about it. So basically, what I try to convey is simply this message. We have been discussing economic security from many different perspectives. As you may know, many people are talking about economic security, and many actually disciplines, not only law, but also the international relations, economics. Many different disciplines are utilizing the term economic security. And I think it is a very wide term. Many things can be covered by economic security. Looking at security from the economic perspective, or looking at economic issues from the security perspective. So if we apply that concept, which is the combination of economy/trade and security, we can cover actually many items under that concept. My view is that when it comes to the issue of economic security, be it semiconductors, be it artificial intelligence, be it supply chain reformulation, then the perception from the states which refer to economic security seems to be based upon the notion that the concept of economic security, that their argument of economic security can be the issue relating to economic security can be justified by national security exception. So, my starting point for inquiry is that on the one hand, many states are referring to economic security. On the other hand, when questions are raised, when challenges are raised, their usual response seems to be that our measures of economic security are justified because they fall under the national security. So I think there's a clear connection between economic security and national security, but economic security is utilized in a very broad meaning, while national security exception under the trade agreements and investment agreements are now the regulated in a more systematic manner. Of course, the national security exception in trade agreements and the investment agreements are themselves quite broad and vague, of course, but still we have achieved a reliable level of regulation, a reliable level of the legal standard for national security exceptions. So my argument is that national security exception jurisprudence should be applied to the discussion of economic security. So some economic security measures can be justified indeed by the national security exceptions, while some economic security measures may not be justified by national security exceptions. If that is the case, then at least those economic security measures could be problematic under the existing trade agreements, be it FTAs or WTO agreements, including GATT or GATS, and they could not be justified by the investment agreements, even though those investment agreements contain national security exceptions as well. So at the same time, maybe we have to find some new template to discuss economic security in a way which caters to the demand and changing circumstances of the global community. So on the one hand, we have to apply the existing norms of trade agreements and investment agreements, but on the other hand, we understand that the national security exceptions in those trade agreements and investment agreements may be outdated now. So some realignment and readjustment may be necessary. Until then, the current exceptions should apply as they are written down, and some economic security measures may not be justified under the current regime with national security exceptions. So that is my theme to deliver today. Let me briefly move on to a couple of slides. We are trying to achieve rules-based system, but it appears that there's a long way to go. The difficulty that we are facing now is fourfold. So the withering multilateralism, US-China conflict, COVID-19, and digital economy, they are all accumulating their weight on the current the complex situation of the current international economic landscape, and it is leading to a very difficult situation. So we'll have to figure it out. We'll have to find a way to overcome the current difficulty. It appears that now we are entering a paradigm shift situation. So we have to find out a new template probably for the international economic governance, including trade agreements and investment agreements. There are many issues to cover, but certainly one of the core issues to be covered and to be discussed now is the concept of national security exceptions and how that national security exception should be understood in the context of economic security, mainly relating to the global supply chain. I think we can talk about supply chains for many different products and technologies. But I think the main issue now for many countries, including China, the United States, Japan, perhaps Korea, EU, those countries are now focusing on the three elements, which are advanced semiconductors and artificial intelligence and quantum computing. So there are many supply chains that we have to consider going forward, but our discussion of supply chain reformulation, at least for the time being, seem to be focused on those three. Semiconductors, not just normal semiconductors, but advanced semiconductors, artificial intelligence, and quantum computing. How do we formulate supply chains for those three items? May be very controversial and may be the key issue between US-China debates and EU and United States debates and the EU-China discussion as well. So that's something we have to focus on when it comes to supply chains. This is just my conclusion. I think when they say decoupling, it was clear And it turns out that decoupling is not workable. And now the concept is de-risking. So under the concept de-risking, I think basically what we are looking at is a dual supply chains. On the one hand, there are the product and technology, the supply chains, either spearheaded by China on the one hand, or hypothetically, or spearheaded by the United States on the other hand, hypothetically, for 3 items. So there is a closed circle supply chains for 3 items, meaning semiconductors and quantum computing and artificial intelligence, which circulates on its own. And then there are supply chains for other products, goods, and services. So my understanding of de-risking is that countries will try to separate supply chains for one group and the supply chains for other group. And for the many products will be covered by the regular ordinary supply chains where perhaps the existing trade norms may apply with some adjustments. However, for the 3 items, it could be 4, but now let's just say for 3 items of key products and technologies, China, United States, other countries will try to seem to be trying to establish supply chains on their own, perhaps for the national security purposes. I think when it comes to supply chains, there are many issues to consider, but it appears that we can consider these 4 challenges regarding supply chains. First one, supply chains by definition envision discriminatory treatment, which is in violation of MFN principle. And supply chains discussion also include subsidization as co-element, subsidization or industrial policy for the key industries, the 3 core areas, and investment restriction, outbound investment, inbound investment restriction, and finally import control, mainly export control. So when it comes to supply chain discussion can lead to a diverse forms of governmental measures, and those governmental measures probably can be grouped into one of the 4, discriminatory treatment by definition, and subsidization through industrial policies, investment restriction, both inbound and outbound, finally, import control / export control for key items and products. Then the question is, how do we justify these 4 measures? How do we legalize these 4 measures, or how do we digest these 4 measures in the existing trade agreements and investment agreements as much as possible? If we cannot do so, if we cannot digest all these new demands for supply chains reformulation, then perhaps we have to find a new template, be it IPF, be it revised CPTPP, be it new digital trade agreements, whatever, we will have to find some new template to accommodate this increasing demand for the dual supply chain system and the operation of supply chain system in a legitimate way. So it implicates trade agreements, investment agreements. The question, there will be many questions, but the question for now, one of the main questions for now is how do we understand the concept of national security exception or essential security exception? So this is what I tried to say in the beginning of my presentation. So the way the term economics, I apologize for the rough drawing skill. This is the best I could do. So the concept of economic security seems to be very broad. It covers a wide areas of economic issues relating to the security. A lot of items, a lot of technologies, and a lot of uncertainties, very wide. And some of the concepts, some of the issues falling under the economic security is covered by national security as we know today. And then the national security exception itself is now being expanded step by step. So not just the military style, military conflict-related national security, but also commercial issue-related national security seems to be covered by the existing national security exceptions. So the Circle A is at the core, which seems to be the original national security exception devised in 1947 GATT, and the Circle B is the relatively wider national security exception, which is being explored by the WTO panels and investment panels to accommodate the increasing demand of the governments to cover their national security interests in the economic sector. And then finally, the Circle C is a broader concept of economic security, which covers a wide range of issues relating to economy, relating to industry, which may have some implication to safeguarding national interest. So how do we find the dividing line A, B, and C seem to be a critical issue for the future. So how do we find the dividing line, particularly dividing line between B and C? C is the economic security that we use today in a very broad and loose manner, while B is the original national security exception now being expanded step by step by the increasing demand from WTO members or the host state's government in investment disputes. So I thought about 4 suggestions mainly. I'll just explain very briefly. First of all, I think one thing we can do, this is just my suggestion, so we can discuss this further later. First, perhaps we have to downgrade our expectation. I think the multilateralism is already in a very difficult situation, and it is not likely that we will go back to the multilateralism that we have known for 28 years under the WTO regime. So how do we have to downgrade our expectation? If the plan A does not work, then plan B and plan C. I think plan C is a very sad situation still, nonetheless. If we can accommodate some core elements of rule of law, that's something we can explore at least. Instead of the current chaotic situation of the international trade regime. Second option, a second issue that we can consider is the security for security. Basically, how do we clarify the meaning of national security, and how do we understand the close relationship between national security and economic security on the other hand? And third suggestion that I come up with is how to address the digital issue. Adopting digital trade norms is critical in this process. Particularly, economic security is closely related to the norms relating to the digital society and digital economy, including artificial intelligence. So how do we find and develop norms in the digital area is one way to address the issue of economic security in the context of national security. Finally, doing this, I think we have to find a new template. It could be, we can, perhaps the discussions at the WTO for the WTO reform, maybe next year after MC13, could provide some new momentum to find a new template. In that discussion of a new template, we can accommodate the increasing demand of many countries, and we can find a new version of national security which accommodate the economic security concept in a more systematic and reliable way for the future. Or we can utilize IPEF, or we can utilize other trade agreements negotiation that we are having, where the national security exceptions can be elaborated in a new way, or economic security is more elaborated in the more systematic context of national security for the future. So that's something we can consider going forward. Because of the time constraint, let me stop here. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Lee, and you really give us a lot of food for thought. And actually, in your conclusion, you mentioned the IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, and I think that provide a nice segue for the next presentation by Professor Nadapura, who will be talking about the inclusive and resilient supply chains, which is one of the key topics and the IPEF. So again, without further ado, let me turn to Professor Nadapura.
Good morning and good afternoon, and perhaps good evening as well. Thank you, Professor Henry, and it was nice to listen to Professor Jamin Lee, whose work I have followed quite a bit. And thank you again, Wei Huan, for actually inviting me for this very interesting and engaging discussion. So my presentation is actually with respect to some of the supply chain vulnerabilities that we have seen in recent times. And the COVID was actually grim reminder. We can vividly remember the kind of disruptions that happened during the COVID period. Medicines were actually in short supply, personal protection equipments, medical devices, they were in short supply. And during that particular period, we came to know about the meaning of the term resilient supply chain. So it meant that countries will have to prioritize building supply chains that can adapt to unforeseen disruption. One of the major challenges that we have seen in the last decade or in the last 15 years is actually the considerable concentration in global supply chain. According to the World Trade Organization, the WTO, the World Trade Report in 2023, 20% of the global exports are actually bottlenecked, which means that their share is substantially high, but these bottleneck products are basically produced only by a few suppliers. So in that context, the real question is how can actually we build resilience. So one option is to basically, diversify or spread the sourcing decisions. The COVID-19 reminded countries that they cannot depend on only one particular source or a country. And the crisis that we saw during the COVID period actually exacerbated during the Ukraine-Russia war. The world was actually dependent upon the Black Sea region for food grains, natural gas, energy resources, fertilizers, and certain edible oils. So when the supply was actually disrupted, there were huge amount of concerns all across the world. So what can actually be a solution? Typically, when it comes to supply chain issues, it is for the firms to basically do very careful and meaningful inventory management. So firms tend to enter into long-term contracts. They go for early booking capacities, and sometimes they actually re-engineer their products. They come up with better designs and supply chain processes. We have also understood the importance of digital technology in supply chain. So there's a greater emphasis on digitizing supply chain processes, incorporating technologies like artificial intelligence, Internet of Things, blockchain for realizing the visibility and decision making. So when we think about the supply chain crisis, in most situations, it is actually a response to a short-term crisis. But we have to also look at the larger concerns. In fact, sometimes long-term sustainability actually requires more strategic planning as well. So let us try to understand what countries generally do whenever there is a crisis. And countries and governments play a very important role. And we have seen during the COVID period as well, whenever there was a disruption, the countries were prompt to act. So we saw a large number of export restrictions, export bans, export duties, export licensing requirements, sometimes import bans as well. So according to WTO, there was actually a 5-fold increase in these categories of quantitative restriction during the COVID period. And that is why in the June 2022 WTO Ministerial Declaration, the Geneva Ministerial Conference, 2 important decisions came out. One was actually the WTO emergency response to pandemic, and the second was a ministerial declaration on the emergency response to food insecurity, where the WTO members actually committed to taking concrete steps to facilitate trade and improve the functioning of long-term resilience of global markets for food and agriculture, including cereals, fertilizers, and other agriculture products. The simple point is that trade protectionism, or as I mentioned earlier, quantitative restrictions, export licensing or export restrictions are actually self-defeating. But there is a human tendency, or you can say a human urge, in order to conserve or preserve during times of crisis. So according to the WTO itself, trade has been largely beneficial in dealing with the pandemic and also with respect to some of the recent crises. So trade is extremely important in order to provide beneficial or maybe better access to products especially for critical products and in products where or sectors where domestic substitutes are not actually immediately available. So what can be done? As we know, the WTO rules are fairly clear. Professor Jaminli mentioned about the MFN requirement, Article 1 of the GATT. You have got Article 11 of the GATT. So the GATT rules are fairly tough in terms of preventing, or you can say, discouraging these kind of protectionist tendencies. But the reality is that we do not have a proper functioning dispute settlement system internationally. So even if countries come up with these kind of measures, which may be self-defeating in the long run, there is no viable mechanism to deal with this kind of crisis. So largely speaking, my submission is that the better way to deal with these issues will be long-term cooperation. And we have got many mechanisms internationally. One is actually the G20. So in the New Delhi Declaration itself, there has been a particular statement with respect to mapping the global value chains and identifying the bottlenecks to global supply chains. So in a way, I think Professor Henry Gav also mentioned about the IPEF agreements, the Pillar 2, Pillar 3, and Pillar 4 to an extent. These IPEF initiatives are also trying to actually encourage collaborative responses between multi-stakeholders, between governments, and between the private sector. And we have understood that collaborative partnerships can help in better communication, information sharing, and mutual support during supply chain disruptions. In a way, I think it is a realization that there has to be some sort of a clearinghouse mechanism, for transparent and critical information on the status, problems, and solutions of the global supply chain management. The another important point that I would like to mention is actually the logistic concerns during the pandemic. We have actually come to know about one crisis, the Suez Canal blockage during that particular period, but that led to many blockades as well, and the logistics cost shot through the roof during that period. And that is one main reason why countries actually wanted to have production facilities near their home. So we actually came to know about two terms. One is actually friendshoring, and the other is nearshoring. These two concerns were again, to an extent, shaped by the supply chain disruption. So I would like to actually read one statement from the latest G20 declaration. It says, being well prepared in advance is crucial for reducing the severity and impact of any disruption. The G20 members, in collaboration with their private sectors, can engage in proactive measures by regularly reviewing trade bottlenecks, vulnerabilities, and other challenges to overcome these difficulties effectively. By taking preemptive action, countries can significantly minimize the adverse consequence of disruption in GVCs and bolster overall resilience. So when we think about the IPEF Pillar 2, I mean, most of us are familiar with respect to the three outcomes that happened, that came up very recently in San Francisco. But the IPEF supply chain pillar was negotiated in Detroit in May 2023. That pillar comes up with a significant amount of cooperative initiatives whenever there is actually disruption in supply chain. So the most important point is that although governments can do pretty little when it comes to supply chain management, the governments can play a very important role in effectively managing the response to supply chain disruption, at least in terms of providing information on a timely manner, actually using the newer technologies, digital technologies, to identify the shortage and mapping the vulnerabilities for that matter, and facilitate better engagement and collaboration between the various stakeholders. The last point which I want to mention here is basically with respect to sustainability. So global supply chain disruption, is a particular response, maybe to various factors, to war, to pandemic. You can name any factor for that matter. But the important point to remember is that, especially in the IPEF supply chain Pillar 3, and in not only in Pillar 3, in Pillar 2, 3, and 4, there are very important provisions that actually deal with sustainability. That actually stems from a particular desire to have, sustainability-oriented reforms in international economic cooperation. So if you really look at, Pillar 3, the Paris Agreement and the United Nations SDG goals are directly in focus. And there is a larger objective to reach the decarbonization goals, which is actually mentioned in the Paris Agreement as well. And again, we are now grappling with the issue of carbon leakage. So many countries fear that lower environment standards can actually lead to industries basically going to pollution haven areas, and that is something that we call by the term carbon leakage. So in order to prevent carbon leakage, there has to be some kind of a harmonization of standards, and that is why a large number of international environment agreements are actually referred to in supply chain agreements as well. In addition to that, the worker-centered trade policy has become very important, and that is actually one of the hallmarks of the Biden administration as well. So if you look at Pillar 2 of the IPEF supply chain agreement, you have got an IPEF labor advisory board. The purpose of that particular provision is to make sure that whenever there is a labor rights inconsistency, that issue can be promptly examined, and an ideal outcome, a particular solution can be achieved by the parties. So in other words, while countries are trying to respond to supply chain crisis, they're also trying to embed some of the deeper concerns like environment concerns related to worker welfare, concerns related to corruption in some of these agreements. The one concern here from a developing country point of view is that the developing countries actually oppose this kind of social clauses in trade agreements and other economic treaties for a very long period of time. But nowadays, I think these kind of provisions are virtually there in every treaty, in most of the free trade agreements, and also with respect to other international cooperation agreement. And we also find a reference to the 1998 ILO fundamental rights under ILO Declaration of Fundamental Rights at Work, which has become a very central document. And Professor Jamin was actually involved in a panel where this particular issue came up in recent times. So one of the concerns of the developing countries is that an issue which they have effectively, I think, blocked at the WTO for a fairly long period of time is now coming through some of these kind of agreements. So what is actually required to be done here? We need to have a fine balance. Sustainability has become an extremely important concern. We can't actually brush it under the carpet. But at the same time, some of these concerns will have to be carefully managed. If sustainability brings in non-trade issues through the back door, it can definitely have some kind of an impact on developing economies as well. The last point which I want to mention here is basically with respect to raw materials and critical minerals. So nowadays, there are many agreements even among countries with respect to raw materials and critical minerals, especially in products like cobalt, copper, graphite, lithium, manganese, nickel, platinum. Many countries would like to preserve these kind of products for their own industrial use. We have seen that kind of a situation in China, rare earth. So these kind of clubs, or you can say critical minerals club, again pose a particular problem to many countries. So it is important to make sure that these kind of clubs do not actually deny access to countries which may not have this kind of products to source these products for their own economic production and other activities. So in a way, I think there's a greater need for cooperation and making sure that some of these non-trade concerns do not unduly impede the ability of these countries to be part of the international production network. So I will stop here, and if anyone has any questions, I'll be glad to take it. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Nadampura, for the excellent presentation and also for keeping within the time limit. That is really great. So your discussion about the supply chain issues are definitely going to be tackled, I think, in some of the conversations hopefully we will have after the panel during the Q&A session. So let me next turn to Professor Fukunaga, who will be talking about economic coercion issues.
Thank you, Professor Gao. Well, my topic is about economic coercion, so it's really very narrowly focused compared to my fellow panelists. And my topic may not be directly related to the panel's topic, but I think it may, and it does arise in the context of decoupling and de-risking. And I'll try to sort of analyze economic coercion from a legal perspective. Well, I'll start with the background. Among G7 members and also European or Western countries, there is a growing recognition that one or a few countries engage in economic coercion. And that sort of consensus, that recognition is reflected in, for example, in the leader's statement this year in March. And let me read some parts of the statement. And it says that the world has encountered a disturbing rise in the instance of economic coercion that seek to exploit economic vulnerabilities and dependencies and undermine the foreign and domestic policies and positions of G7 members and other countries. And the G7 leaders work together to ensure that attempts to weaponize economic dependencies by forcing G7 members and other partners to comply and conform will fail and face consequences. So it doesn't precisely define economic coercion, but there's an element of coercion. It's a weaponization of economic dependencies. And what about the legality of economic coercion? Let me again read the middle part of the paragraph. And this statement says that economic coercion not only undermines the functioning of and trust in the multilateral trading system, but also infringes upon the international order centered on respect for sovereignty and the rule of law, and ultimately undermines global security and stability. So it doesn't mention that economic coercion is a violation of international law, but it suggests that it has an element of international law inconsistency in economic coercion. And then how can the G7 members respond to economic coercion? Again, this statement raises some policy options against economic coercion. And the policy options include, for example, the collaboration, information sharing, and so on. So multilateral or plurilateral responses are preferred options, but the statement also mentioned unilateral responses. So again, at the very last part of this paragraph, the statement says that where appropriate, the G7 members counter economic coercion in accordance with their respective legal systems. So it suggests, the statement suggests that G7 members may use unilateral measure to counter economic coercion. So my questions are the following. First, the definition of economic coercion. The statement does not precisely define economic coercion, but I'll try to sort of give you some ideas about what economic coercion is, and I'll try to explore on the consistency of economic coercion with international law, including WTO law. And then my next question is how countries can react to economic coercion. Again, like I said, the statement suggests that multilateral and plurilateral responses are preferred, but my presentation focuses on unilateral responses, and I'll try to sort of examine whether unilateral responses are consistent with WTO law and international law. And there's an issue of consistency with IIA's investment agreements, but given the time limit, I'm not going to address the issue with IIAs. So I'll go through 3 different domains of law. First, WTO law. The second is the EU's anti-coercion instrument, the ACI, which was adopted recently and which will come into force, I believe, this year. And finally, briefly, I'll speak about the relevance of public international law. And I'm not going to try to answer these questions, but I'm trying to sort of shed light, explain what elements have to be considered in addressing these questions. So first, WTO. Economic coercion normally uses trade restrictive or discriminatory measures. So in many cases, economic coercion is a violation of WTO obligations. I'm not saying that economic coercion is always a violation of WTO obligations. There may be cases where economic coercion does not amount to WTO violations, but perhaps in many cases it does amount to a violation of WTO obligations. However, what I want to emphasize here is that mere economic coercion should not be equated with a mere violation of WTO obligations. There has to be some additional element. And like we saw in the statement by the G7 leaders, there has to be an element of coercion. There has to be an element of forcing other countries to do something or not to do something. So the important thing here is that mere economic coercion is not just a violation of WTO obligations, but beyond that, there is an additional element. So based on that assumption, based on that understanding, the next question is, how can WTO members respond to economic coercion? And first of all, when we think about a response to a WTO violation, we all know that Article 23 of the DSU prohibits a unilateral response to a WTO violation. Article 23 of the DSU says that when a member seeks the redress of a WTO violation, it has to go to WTO dispute settlement system. So unilateral response to a WTO violation is prohibited by Article 23 of the DSU. But what about economic coercion? What if a member seeks the redress of economic coercion? Then perhaps the member may use unilateral response. WTO member may not be prevented by Article 23 of the DSU from using unilateral response to the economic coercion. But that does not mean that WTO member can do whatever they like. And in order to counter economic coercion, WTO members may use trade restrictive or trade discriminatory measures, and those measures could violate other WTO obligations than Article 23 of the DSU. And then there's an issue of whether those violations, for example, maybe anti-coercive actions may violate Article 3 of GATT, or maybe it may violate Article 11 of the GATT. And there's an issue of whether these violations can be justified by Article 20 or Article 21, the security exception, or not. But what I want to sort of highlight here is that economic coercion is different from a mere violation of WTO obligations, and Article 23 of the DSU may not prevent WTO members from using unilateral responses. Now, the EU ACI. The EU's ACI defines economic coercion very broadly. Article 2 of the ACI, if I read the Article 2, paragraph 1, it says that economic coercion exists where a third country applies or threatens to apply a third country measure affecting trade or investment in order to prevent or obtain the cessation, modification, or adoption of a particular act by the Union or a member state, thereby interfering in the legitimate sovereign choices of the Union or a member state. So again, the tool is trade or investment measure, and the purpose of economic coercion is to prevent or obtain the cessation, modification, adoption of a particular act by the Union or a member state. So the purpose is to force the EU or a member state to do something or not to do something. But it doesn't say anything about the legality of economic coercion as defined by this provision. So it's very broad, it's very vague, and we don't really know what they have in mind as economic coercion. But to shed some additional light, Article 2, paragraph 2 lists up some factors that have to be considered in the determination of the existence of economic coercion. I'm not going to read out all the factors, but anyway, again, the point here is that the definition presented by the ACI is very broad, very vague, and that could include almost anything. So how about responses provided in ACI? The Annex 1 of the ACI has a list of measures that can be applied to counter economic coercion. For example, the EU can take new or increased customs duties or additional charge or restrictions on importation or exportation, restrictions on payment for goods and so on. So these are unilateral responses. They call it union response measures. But there is like a high threshold to apply to use these unilateral union response measures. So if you look at Article 8.1, it says the Commission shall adopt unilateral responses, but only when all the stipulated conditions are met. For example, subparagraph A says action pursuant to Articles 5 and 6 has not resulted in the cessation of the economic coercion, and where the requested has not resulted in the reparation of the injury. So meaning Articles 5 and 6 provide that the EU shall try to solve the problem by collaborating or cooperating with the relevant countries. So only if the cooperation does not solve the issue, the EU can have can use unilateral responses. The second condition is that the adoption of the unilateral measures has to be necessary to protect the interest and rights of the EU and the member states. And the third condition is that the adoption of the unilateral responses has to be in the union's interest. So the threshold is very high, but the EU can take trade restrictive measures against economic coercion where necessary. And if you look at Article 8, paragraph 4, it says, insofar as the third country measure constitute an internationally legally wrongful act, union responses measure may consist of measures that amount to the non-performance of international obligations. So I said before that economic coercion, as defined by the ACI, is very broad. It can include anything. It can include measures that are not inconsistent with international law. But if economic coercion is inconsistent with international law, then EU can take measures inconsistent with international law against country using economic coercion. Public international law perspective. Because I don't have much time, I'm not going into detail of the ICJ judgment in Nicaragua. But what the Nicaragua judgment says is that the principle of non-intervention is part and parcel of customary international law. So if an economic coercion can be considered as intervention, prohibited intervention, and then we can say that economic coercion is a violation of international law. But what was issued in Nicaragua case was that what was the use of force. So we know that intervention through use of force is a violation of the principle of non-intervention, but there is a question of when the use of economic tools can be considered as a prohibited intervention. And responses against intervention. Because of the time, I briefly mentioned that countermeasures can be taken against prohibited intervention. So I presented how vague the definition of economic coercion is, but if we adopt a very narrow definition, it's beyond a mere WTO violation, and it may be kind of similar to a violation of the principle of non-intervention, but through economic measures. And then responses, just briefly, there may be room for unilateral responses allowed under WTO and international law. I conclude my presentation now. Thank you very much for your attention. That's all for me.
Thank you very much, Professor Fukunaga, for that really interesting presentation on economic coercion. So next we will have Professor Jingjia Xu, who will be talking about decoupling or de-risking. Professor Xu, please.
Thank you so much, Henry. Of course, my sincere thanks also go to Wei Huan for the kind invitation for me to speak at the CBEL 2023 forum. It's my great honor joining this group of distinguished colleagues for this session. My presentation mainly tries to understand, if not clarifying, the concepts of decoupling and the de-risking, perhaps not too much addressing on that interaction with the specific WTO trade rules, because during my research on this topic, I found that actually, because it's still at early stage for countries to practicing de-risking, it seems hard to analyze the WTO compliance. So to start, I'd like to mention that although trade remains resilient with a projected growth of 1.7 in 2023, but we can see the aftermath or aftershocks of COVID-19 and escalating geopolitical tensions still raise a lot of uncertainties. So we have seen the emergence of a few of creative words, including but not limited to so-called anti-globalization, deglobalization, slowbalization, reglobalization, decoupling, de-risking, as well as defogging, which I just learned from Professor Jiamin Li in the beginning of this session. But for the purpose of this presentation, I'm focusing on two concepts, decoupling and de-risking. It is understood that heightened tensions do not serve actually anyone's interest. The decoupling between the West and China could be extraordinarily costly. It is neither desirable nor even feasible to cut off our economic ties with the world's second largest economy right now. It also makes little sense to forego China-sourced products that are relatively cheaper, better, or both. In doing so would make it more difficult for European and American companies to truly decouple with China. Thus, for a short period after EC President van der Leyen deployed the phrase early in this March, there is a rhetorical shift which has led to a much vaguer concept, de-risk or de-risking. This term, I think, owes its new popularity to the turn away from decoupling, as it turned out that almost no one favors a definitive break between China and the West, including the US. So right now, we can see it is widely agreed there is a need to de-risk, but not decouple from China. In the meantime, it is also recognized economic resilience requires de-risking and diversifying from Chinese products. The G7 statement, as mentioned by Professor Yuka just now, also addressing the issue of fostering resilience to economic cohesion, and it is recognized that the necessity of protecting certain advanced technologies that could be picked up by Professor Li as well, that could be used to threaten national security without unduly limiting trade and investment. I also note in the meantime, G7 statement also said, G7 states they stand prepared to build constructive and stable relations with China, recognizing the importance of engaging kindly with and expressing concern directly to China. This is like two-sided ways dealing with China. Along with the new buzzword shifting to de-risking, there is a clear problem. While decoupling is relatively clear, de-risking is open to many interpretations. As often happens in diplomacy, the vagueness might be intentional. So it's conveniently papered over differences between the US and some of its allies. But what is the difference between de-risking and decoupling on Earth? As I can see on the surface, decoupling implies taking separation from China further than de-risking. De-risking suggests diversifying, ending exclusive reliance on China rather than withdrawal. In practice, though, much of the decoupling to date has also been diversification. The G7 statement even didn't mention that the foremost object of both decoupling and de-risking is China. G7 leaders simply said they were coordinating their approaches to economic resilience and economic security, as addressed by Professor Jiamin Li, based on diversifying partnerships and de-risking rather than decoupling. But for China, there is no meaningful difference actually between de-risking and decoupling. I would like to mention this. In commercial reality, we understand that risks are inherent in all economic activity and in market economies as well. So the willingness to take risk drives innovation, growth, and great prosperity. If an economy without risk were possible, it would offer no rewards as either. While some risk is unavoidable, most try to manage it responsibly. In this sense, de-risking seems to be a constant, uncontroversial feature of an open economy. But the new political rhetoric takes things further, as we recognize. It implies that trade with China is inherently risky, regardless of the domestic business and the investment environment. So as my observation goes, framing such as the 4 highs, which means high tariffs, controls on access to high technology, high quality coordination with allies, and high industrial subsidies, captured the target nature of Western states' efforts to adjust their economic and technological relationship with China. Economic resilience and economic security are diplo-speak for avoiding over-reliance on China, and to some extent Russia as well, for key products, and avoiding supplying those countries with strategically sensitive technologies. The essence of de-risking, as my understanding goes, is to reduce excessive dependence in critical supply chains while emphasizing the need to cooperate with China, considering its role in the international community and the size of its economy. Given the recent experience, it's sensible to focus on making global supply chains the lifeblood of the global economy more resilient to shocks and disruptions. For example, the recent communique of G20 trade ministers put much emphasis on one key priority, which is preserving the resilience of global value chain. Global value chains are indeed, as we understand, the defining feature of the era of globalization. For more than 40 years, we have seen the progressive expansion of production networks that connect all nations through a global flow of trade in intermediate goods. The intrinsic link between value chains, global value chains, and the supply chains, we can say without supply chains, actually no value chain. Without value chains, actually no globalization. So in this sense, trade serves as a shock absorber through one crisis after another, as well as an enabler of resilience. Nevertheless, the shortages and the bottlenecks of the past years have exposed the genuine vulnerability in a way that supply chains are organized. Together with rising geopolitical and geoeconomic tensions, this has spurred a growing call for reshoring, nearshoring, and friendshoring. Reshoring could also make supplies, you can say, even more concentrated, increasing vulnerabilities. So this is a kind of awkward situation. Also it has led to reduced cooperation on trade, which would make it harder to tackle global common problems. For example, adding risks to growth and sustainability. So while some reshoring looks inevitable, and businesses are already using the term de-risking strategy, letting reshoring turn into a wider policy-induced retreat from trade would be or might be costly and probably ineffective. So the key issue here is how to strengthen supply chains to reduce vulnerabilities from disruption. First, I think that international cooperation is still indispensable to support efficient supply chains. The WTO's TBT committee has been the hub for dialogue on multilateral standards for regulation for over a quarter century. This collaborative space addresses frame the word trade concerns, thus being helpful to avoid further trade frictions. Highlighting the spirit of cooperation, China's initiative in the run-up to the WTO MC 13 to be held Dubai in proposing a draft ministerial decision on international cooperation on regulatory and the standards related matters might be worth for attention. Second, as touched upon just by Professor Jamin Lee, we now live in an era of digital economy. WTO members, as we can see in recent years, have delved into topics ranging from cybersecurity to artificial intelligence. The rapidly evolving digital economy will be heavily influenced by smart products, which are consistently interconnected and data-driven. So in this sense, uniform standards and regulation are vital for interoperability and safety, which also underpins the Internet of Things. To this end, I expect or I hope that de-risking is fairly narrowly focused on advanced semiconductors and related technologies, paralleling narrowly defined export controls, and do not anticipate significant restrictions on secondary market portfolio investment. Of course, that's my hope. I'm not sure whether it will take place or not. But anyway, the economic implications of a further decoupling or de-risking between the West and China could be far-reaching. China could also retaliate by curtailing the supply of critical raw materials in which it has a dominant position, which could severely disrupt global supply chains. Lastly, I'm thinking about the question as to whether the WTO dispute resolution settlement system can address this kind of challenge. The two-tier WTO dispute settlement is now non-functioning with the collapse of its appellate body. But a panel, the first tier, for example, ruled against the national security reasoning behind the U.S. steel and aluminum tariffs in December last year, but was sharply criticized by the U.S., which has convened that it will appeal, meaning that the panel ruling cannot become binding. USTR Catherine Tai also opined that the WTO panel was getting itself on a very thin ice in making such a ruling by second guessing the national security judgment of a democratic government such as the United States. In sum, I'm not saying in conclusion because I don't have actually, I'm raising more questions than answers. So I think the channelization or the channelization 去中国化 for those who understand Chinese in the name of de-risking is might be likely to decouple from opportunities, cooperation, stability, and final development. One of the tasks so we are facing now seems to de-risk the concept of de-risking before we undermine our global prospects unnecessarily. Lastly, to conclude, I want to quote WTO Director General Dr. Koji Avila, a strong and effective WTO is still vital tool for building resilience in an increasingly shock-prone global economy. She called for a strategy of reglobalization which would build great resilience by bringing in more marginalized countries and communities into the global economic mainstream. So a simple message I would like to convey here is at a time when the future of globalization is greatly challenged by whatever reasons, whatever many phenomena. Investing in efficient supply chains is one of the important tools to support the resilience of global value chains. The WTO is still very pivotal for fulfilling this task. So the key to success for our global economy is more multilateral cooperation. Not less. I would like to stop here. Thanks for your time and attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Shi. So we already have questions coming in from the audience. I want to thank you all for submitting the questions. So we have about 16 minutes left. So I think we have at least one question each for the 4 panelists. So maybe let me just briefly summarize the questions and then ask the panelists to comment on the questions which are specifically directed to you. For each of you to answer in about 4 minutes time, if that's possible. So first, that's the question to Professor Jimin Li on the definition of economic security. And also there's another question from Wang Haoxue, I think also directed to you, on the IPEF supply chain issue.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Henry. And I'd like to thank the audience for the questions. I just noted a question from Professor Zhu, Weiwan Zhu, and the question is very difficult. I think that is the fundamental question that needs to be addressed. And here's my short answer, as much as I can. I agree with Professor Zhu, and I think First of all, I think the current national security exception is not sufficient enough. I think we need to do something about national security exceptions to address the increasing concern of the states. That is my view. But at the same time, unless and until the new agreement or new provisions adopted in the future, we have to deal with existing jurisprudence within the existing agreements. In that respect, I think what we can do is to focus on the specific languages in the national security exceptions. And when it comes to economic security, the term that can be utilized in this regard, that can be applied in this regard, is the term that Professor Wei Wan-Chu mentioned in his question, which is the emergency in international relations. So that can be utilized to deal with economic security in many respects. For instance, the war or other emergency in international relations, as the term is appearing in Article 21 of the GATT, was interpreted by the WTO panel in Russia traffic in transit as follows. Basically, the panel was just saying that because the use of the term the conjunction or war or other international emergency, other emergency in international relations was interpreted to mean that economic situations can be covered, but that economic situation can be something similar to a war or military conflict, which means it should be serious enough or grave enough. And the panel stated that not just the concern on the economic situation or the conflict among states in and of itself is not sufficient to invoke the term of emergency in international relations. So using that the decision of the panel, I would say that economic security issues can be covered by the current Article 21 or the similar national security exceptions in many other treaties and agreements. However, that economic security situation to be covered by the national security exceptions of today must be grave enough in a way that is shown that it touches upon the existence of the state or the existence of the economic independence itself is challenged. So that may be one way of understanding the national security exception in the context of economic security. That said, my conclusion is that that high threshold is to be separated from the general understanding of economic security of today by many countries. So we see the gap between the norm of today and the increasing concern of the states of today. The question then is, how do we narrow the gap? I think the current provision is not sufficient enough or detailed enough to fill the gap, to address the concerns of the states. That can be done. That can only be done by adopting new treaties, by adopting new provision in the future for national security exceptions or economic security exceptions for that matter.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Next, we have one question for Professor James Nadapura, also about the IPEF supply chain agreement.
Thank you, Professor Henry, and thank you, Weikuen, for that question. So you have basically asked about the IPEF supply chain agreement. It is a new category, or you can say new. It's a sui generis agreement. We haven't seen this kind of an agreement. In many ways, it actually looks like an MOU. But if you really look at this agreement, the basic purpose seems to be to identify the supply chain vulnerability. And if at all there is a supply chain crisis, then to have a mechanism in order to readily respond to this kind of a supply chain crisis. And also, it provides for identifying critical sectors and key products. So I think if you really look at this agreement, it appears that it is trying to provide some kind of a framework to make the world ready, or at least the partner countries ready in order to meet any kind of a future pandemic or any kind of a particular crisis. But there are also some views that it can be actually a precursor to a decoupling kind of a provision, or a decoupling agreement for that matter. Ultimately, that is not very clear from the text of the agreement. My own feeling is that given the nature of this agreement, everything will depend upon what will happen in the future. So the IPEF agreement has got a supply chain council, and the supply chain council can come up with its own action plan. So the action plan will determine how this agreement will be implemented in the future. So will it be a cooperative agreement? Will countries actually put in investment over there? In a way, I think my own feeling is that this is actually nudging or encouraging investment along the supply chain. So if there are 14 countries in the IPEF community or in the IPEF region, this agreement seeks to promote investment based upon certain kind of ethos or values. So that seems to be the objective behind it. But on the external side, on the face of the agreement, it looks like an agreement to meet some of the contingencies or crises for that matter. So what are the positive developments? My own feeling is that, and Veiko has asked a question, can it be replicated at the WTO or the multilateral level? Ideally, it should be. And this is one point that came up in this presentation as well. It is impossible to have, a world without supply chain disruption, without China. And China being such a dominant player, China has to be part of it. But certain element of de-risking is also inbuilt into the, maybe part of the thought process actually. But ultimately, I think one has to understand that the best bet against any kind of a supply chain disruption is a well-functioning WTO. A well-functioning WTO will make sure that countries cannot actually put barriers and restrictions, either export or import barriers, other categories or discriminatory provisions in relation to their trade policies. So since the WTO is not actually functioning that well, I mean, at least the dispute settlement function is not functioning that properly, there is a tendency that countries will try to have these kind of arrangements. And again, as I mentioned earlier, the critical mineral agreement, it is actually a club again. It goes against the WTO. The WTO features the kind of critical minerals will be available or made available only within a particular community or within the club. That goes against the non-discriminatory character of the WTO. So in a way, I feel that I think the best solution or the best bet against any kind of a supply chain disruption is a WTO, well-functioning WTO for that matter. If you look at the trade facilitation agreement under the WTO, it is in a way an agreement to make sure that trade goes smoothly between countries for that matter. But given the decision-making difficulties in WTO, it may be quite difficult to have this kind of an agreement replicated at the multilateral level. So there are a number of good features, but at the same time, this is not a market access agreement. Some people can argue that it is more or less like an MOU. So what is the incentive for a country to even comply with labor sustainability kind of a concern? Maybe you can say that if a country doesn't comply with it, it won't actually get the investment. So I think we had to wait and watch how it really functions. But some of the mechanisms like the supply chain, the crisis network, the supply chain council, they are looking pretty promising in a way. And there is something called, as I mentioned earlier, the labor advisory board, the IPEF labor advisory board. It looks like an ILO tripartite mechanism as well. So these are not very innovative, but let's see how it functions in the future. Thank you.
And then we also have a question for Professor Yuka Fukunaga regarding the ACI and the WTO rules.
Yes, thank you. I'll try to be brief. And the question that I got is about the legality or justifiability of anti-coercive measure. So an anti-coercive measure against economic coercion can be WTO inconsistent, but can also be WTO consistent. But if it's WTO inconsistent and if it violates GATT obligations, I think it can be justified by, for example, Article 20A as a measure necessary to protect public morals, or it can be justified by the security exception, Article 21. But we have to look at particular facts of a particular case. So it's really dangerous to overgeneralize about the justifiability under Article 20 or 21. But let me just add one point that I didn't address in my presentation. Even if the anti-coercive measure is not justified by Article 20 or 21, what if the member taking the measure says, well, this may be a WTO violation, this may not be justified by WTO, but this is justified as countermeasures by public international law. And there's a question about how public international law interplays with WTO law. And this is a really difficult question that I don't address now. Thank you.
We also have a question from Brad Williams for Professor Xu regarding the U.S.-China relationship, especially the withdrawal of Section 232 tariffs and the retaliation from China.
Thank you. In the interest of timing, I'd like to combine my answers to questions posed by Henry, Wei Huan, and Hao Xue from the audience. Basically, you are asking the ways to deal with the de-risking challenge and how to enhance the economic resilience and security of global value chain. This, of course, involves the major players in the global economy. There are three possible ways I'd like to suggest here. One is rigorous and full adjudication by the WTO in all cases, bringing great predictability and adherence to the rule-based order. The other is China itself seeing merits in reversing course to become a more open market economy. A third possibility is that this entire idea of resilience and trusted partnerships will go against the grain of competitiveness and efficiency, and may eventually fail. So this also raises the question whether the WTO may restore a well-functioning dispute mechanism by 2024, and if it did, whether it will have the strength to be able to hear all the cases, including some of foregoing measures. Present indications are not optimistic, I have to be frank. But note that the US also highlighted the need for WTO reform and said the primacy of tariff reduction as the driving force of the global trade agenda was over. They emphasized instead of a paradigm where the US was working with its allies to building manufacturing capacity in key sectors and resilience via supply chains to withstand shocks such as climate change, wars, and pandemics, which China can play an important role as well. So in this sense, I maintain cautious optimism. Thank you so much. I will stop my answer here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Shi. Cautious optimism. I think that is a nice note to stop on, for our panel. So let us again thank our four great panelists for their thought-provoking presentations. And I also wish to thank Professor Wei Huan Zhou and his team at UNSW, including Fion and Hannah, for kindly setting up the conference and managing the technicalities of the program today. And I'm really glad that our panel went uneventful, all very smoothly. So thank you all again for joining us at this panel. We hope that you enjoyed this 1.5 hours with us. Please feel free to contact the panelists if you have any follow-up questions. Thank you again, and I wish you all a good afternoon.